5-star. I didn't know it was American, like 3-star, 6-star.
Okay. So we're going to learn about the test that Hashem gave to Avram Avinu. Hashem gave Avram Avinu 10 tests, and this week, at the end of this week's Torah portion, it talks about the 10th test. What was the 10th test? Hashem told Avram to bring his son Yitzchak as a sacrifice to Hashem. And Avram, of course, listened to Hashem, and as we read in the end of the Torah, end of this week's Torah portion. Question all the commentaries ask, as the Rambam asks in the Guide to Perplexed, what was the point of this test? It's a very unusual test. It's very different than the other tests. He told Avram to do something that he didn't actually want him to do. He told him to bring him as a sacrifice, and didn't end up happening that way. So the Rambam says that there's two possible explanations about why Hashem gave Avram this test. One explanation is that Hashem wanted to publicize to us, so we should know how far we have to be dedicated to Hashem. By him telling Avram Avinu that he should even give up his son, the Rambam says, can you imagine someone who was barren for so many years, then he finally has a child, and how hard it would be to give that child's life up? So Rambam says that you could imagine what kind of how deep grief that would cause this person, and despite that, Hashem says, I want you to do this anyways, and he does this. You can imagine what kind of dedication that requires. So the purpose of this test was to express how dedicated we have to be to serve Hashem. That's what the Maimonides writes in the Guide to Perplexed. He writes another reason. He also writes that the purpose of this was to let us know how strongly the prophets believe in their prophecy. Although only Moshe Rabbeinu had this face-to-face discussion with Hashem, and Avram Avinu says all the prophets, it was through riddles, it was in a vision, it was in a dream, and so you might say that their vision was they trusted it somewhat, but they weren't really sure about it. When you see that Avram Avinu actually went to offer his son as a sacrifice, that tells you that they really trusted what they heard from Hashem. That's how the Rambam explains the purpose of that case. And although there was no one there present when Avram offered Yitzchak, even the two lads that accompanied Avram to the mountain also weren't there. But then the Torah says this was to publicize something, but it wasn't to publicize it at that time. It was to publicize to future generations these 2 points. That's what the Rambam says, and that's why there was a 3-day wait. Hashem told Avram Avinu to bring him as a sacrifice, and for 3 days he had to travel to get to the mountain. The purpose of the 3-day traveling was people might say, "Oh, he was impulsive. He heard this from Hashem, and he wasn't really sure what to do, and just like did something without thinking." So Hashem made him travel for 3 days so that it should be clear this wasn't just an impulsive decision, but it was something that he really was dedicated.
Let me ask you a question. Okay, so we'll just jump forward to Moshe Rabbeinu, okay? The greatest prophet of all, okay? Would he have accepted such a decision? When Rabbeinu Shalom said, "Listen, I'm very angry. I'm punishing these people." Moshe said, "I'm not part of your wagon. Take me up the wagon. I'm getting out of here." So Avraham Avinu doesn't say that. He says, "I'm with you. What you telling me I'm doing." So there's a big difference between the two. Okay.
Wow.
I'm not sure would Moshe Rabbeinu accept such a psak from Rabbeinu Shalom. Listen, your son, you got to kill him. That's it. Can't see. Moshe would say, "Listen, if this is what you are about, okay, my son, then you know what? This is not for me, correct? You know, kill an Egyptian, yeah. But my neshama, you're asking me, this is too much. I can't do it, okay?" So just asking a question. You can say, "Shut up, leave it for later."
No, okay? you're asking a very good question. I never thought of that question. It's a great question. One difference between these two scenarios is that Hashem, the emphasis in the story of Moshe Rabbeinu, is that Moshe Rabbeinu gave up his connection to Torah to save the Jewish people. He threw down the tablets to protect the Jewish people. So the question was the Torah or the Jewish people, and he says that the Jewish people are more precious to me than the Torah. But here there's a commandment of Hashem, and Moshe Rabbeinu actually had to punish many of the Jews who served the idol, and he did punish them. He did kill them. So there is, in fact, in the story of the sin of the golden calf, we find a different question from the opposite end. The Torah says in the Zeis HaBracha that there were many Leviim who had to kill their family. It says the children of Levi should go kill all the sinners. And many Leviim had to kill their cousins. You know, their mother was not a Levi, and they didn't hesitate to do what Hashem asked them to do. So the question is, what's so great about what Avraham Avinu did? If we find in history many other people who gave their lives. Unfortunately, there are no Jewish saints. No Jewish saints, because by other religions, it was a story. It was a story. One person who gave their life for their religion. By the Jews, the Crusaders killed whole towns, for example. And not just the Crusaders, but throughout history, there was men, women, and children gave their life rather than give up their Yiddishkeit. So what's the big deal about Avram Avinu that we mention every single day? Some say that what was unique about Avram was that it wasn't him, he was going to kill his son. But also in the story of the Levim,
he also wants to kill his progeny, his continuation of the Jewish people. He wipes the Yitzhak out, okay?
Nobody else.
And then it's what's going to happen?
So Chana actually told Hashem, she said, Avram brought one Akedah, I brought, in the story of Chana and her 7 sons, in the story of Hanukkah, she said, Avram only brought one, I brought 7 Akedahs. So what's unique about Avram? So some say that what was unique about Avram was that, actually Chassidic says, what was unique about Avram was that he was the first. He was the first one to give his life for Hashem. But if that's what the point is, it says the language Chassidus uses is he opened up the pipeline of sacrifice. He was psichas hatziner. He opened up the gateway, the pipeline of sacrifice. It sounds like it wasn't there before in the world, this ability of sacrifice. And Avram Avinu brought this to the world. So what does that mean? It wasn't here and he brought it here. And also, Avram Avinu had 10 challenges, this was the 10th. So if we're talking about being the first, then let's talk about his first test. Let's talk about when he was a child and his father brought him to the king Nimrod and said to the king, this guy is very dangerous, you should kill him. And Avram Avinu remained steadfast that he's going to die rather than denounce his belief in Hashem. So his sacrifice for the sake of Hashem didn't begin in the story of the Akedas. If we're talking about being the first, so Avram Avinu did other acts of sacrifice prior to this. So we're still left with what's unique about this last challenge. So much so, the Medrash actually uses the words, please pass this test. Hashem says in the first verse over there, it says, please take your son. And the Medrash says, why does God say please? And the Medrash says, God says, I want you to pass this test. Because if you don't pass this test, everyone will say all the other tests, and there are no mamashas, there's no substance to them. Now, what's unique about this test on the surface, different than the other tests? Avraham Avinu was so kind, so refined, so wonderful, so giving, so loving. It says in the Sefer Vayeira, it says that God's attribute of kindness, complained to God and said to God, from the day that you created the world, I've been serving you. The attribute of God's kindness has been channeling God's kindness to the world. But the moment that Avram has been born, I got nothing to do. He's channeling your kindness. So it's possible to think that all of Avram's actions until that point, they all were for the sake of his kindness, his love. And this is the first time that Avram had to do something different. He had to do something which exhibited his fear of Hashem, his devotion to go against his love, against his kindness. And that's why on the surface, that's why this is the challenge, which tells you something different about him that you didn't know before. Till now, you could say everything he did was out of love, out of kindness. Here is something that requires an opposite feeling. Here's something that requires the opposite of love. And still he did it. That shows you that Avraham Avinu was really devoted to Hashem because he went against his nature. That's what some commentaries offer. That was unique about this test. He went against his nature. But the language of the Medrash, which says, please pass this test, or everyone will say there's nothing in the first tests. It sounds like there's something else entirely different over here, that there's something else over here, because you can't say about the first tests that they're nothing. You could say there's something unique about this test. You have to go against his nature. But you can't say the first tests are nothing. The language of the Medrash has some other kind of yardstick it's using. And that's why it's saying all the first 9 tests are 0. And this test is something. So let's go back to the language of Chassidus for a second. It was the test that opened the channel of sacrifice. It brought something to the world that wasn't there before. We find a few other examples in history of various tzaddikim who did something that introduced something to the world that wasn't there before. For example, it's about the Mizitcha Maggid. Sometimes the Maggid would say Torah, and no one knew what he was saying. No one understood it. And he said that he's saying these teachings just to bring them into the world. The Rebbe said something similar once. I don't remember the exact date, but there was something similar. That the custom that the Rebbe has of late is to say, just bring things into the world of speech. Just to bring things into the world through his speech. There's this famous story with the author of the Shulchan Aruch of Beis Yosef. Beis Yosef had an angel that taught him Torah. And the Beis Yosef once stayed up at night, and actually we mentioned the story last week, as Obzev pointed out. I mention the story very often. It's a good story. He discovers this passage in Talmud that is inexplainable, and he works really hard and he gets the explanation. And he meets someone in the synagogue, and he wants to share with him this incredible insight that he has of this passage in Talmud that can't be explained. And he goes over to this guy and tells him, I want to share with you something that I've just discovered. He tells him the question. The other guy says, why can't you just say this? And the guy said off the bat, without even thinking, this incredible insight that Beis Yosef took a whole night to figure out. Maybe more, I think it was a few days even. So the Beis Yosef thought to himself, if this guy knows this answer off the bat, this must mean that my gift that I have for understanding Torah was taken away. If he knows this off the bat, it must mean that my gift so he asked the angel who taught him Torah, did I lose something here? So the angel said, you didn't lose anything. The reason this guy knew this was because you brought something new in the world. By bringing this answer into the world, now everyone can learn it. Since you made such an effort and brought this new Torah teaching in the world, you understood it, so now it's accessible. You brought this information in the world, now it's accessible. Similar thing we learned last week. The Alter Rebbe was addressing the question of the passing of a tzaddik in Tanya. So the Rebbe says that when you have different kinds of questions, but if there's such a question that's so weighty that makes all the questions it makes all the questions stronger, because it's like the foundation of all questions. So therefore, the Alter Rebbe, unusually in Tanya, doesn't just explain this, but he writes the letter 27 in Tanya, Gersa Kodesh. He adds an explanation for this explanation. He has a beer on the beer, and the reason is, Alter Rebbe says he wants to bring into the world this information, so that this question shouldn't be something that weighs on the Chassidim, even though the Rebbe said that it still weighs on us. But still, the Alter Rebbe wanted to change the atmosphere in the world and to make this more palatable, maybe make this more livable. So even though we don't understand it, but the Alter Rebbe brought this into the world. This explanation, and once you ever give the example, lifting up a house. If you want to raise a building, you have to raise it from the bottom of the building. So by answering the hardest of questions about the passing of a tzaddik, that makes all the questions in Chassidus more easier to explain. Anyways, getting back to Avram, when we say you open up the pipeline of sacrifice, what does that mean? He gave up his life. He gave up his son's life. It says that when Avram and Yitzchak were walking to the Akedah, you know what they were doing? While they were walking to the Akedah for 3 days, the previous Rebbe said, can you imagine the previous Rebbe says, the joy they had walking together? It such a father, such a son, walking together. Can you imagine what kind of joy? Bible critics talk about the story, and they ruin it. And they make it sound like Avram was very cold and this and distant. But you see in the story, you see a lot of romance in the story, a lot of unusual relationship. Father, yes, my son. Why? Where's the lamb? My son. There's. He calls him my son. He's my father. That's just an aside. Getting back to our subject. What did Avram bring to the world that wasn't there before? What didn't he brought something to the world that wasn't there before? What wasn't there? Why do you have to bring something into the world? Why can't people just be able to give their lives for things? So the author writes these words in Torah. He says, it's possible to give up your life because you want to get Gan Eden. Person gives up his life, and he says, I know if I'll give up my life here, and when I do, I'm going to get Gan Eden. The author says that's not sacrifice. That's business. I'll give up this, and I'll get something better. Similarly, all acts of so-called sacrifice could be rationalized, could be explained, could be for some kind of gain, spiritual gain, physical gain, ideological gain. A human being, the author says, is incapable of doing something higher than himself. The author says, if there's a rationale, if there's logic, it's not sacrifice. A human being, author says these words. Just like when someone's in prison, they can't free themselves. It's impossible to free yourself when you're in prison. Or you can't lift yourself up by pulling your hair, right? Doesn't give that example. I've tried that a few times. It hasn't worked. So you can't free yourself, right? It's impossible to free yourself. You need someone else to free you. So similarly, the author says a human being can't do something that is contrary to his existence. Our center of gravity is ourselves. Whatever we do is always a mirror back to ourselves. And the Futtapaz used to say, wherever we turn, there's a selfish motive. There's always a motive. So a human being can't do that. But Avram Avinu, he brought something godly in the world, something otherworldly. He brought something from Hashem into the world. What did he bring from Hashem? He brought this idea of something beyond existence, beyond self, beyond ego. A human being actually can't do something which is not self-based. It's impossible. It always goes back to you. But Hashem gave Avram in that moment something otherworldly. It says actually, Avram put Yitzchak on top of the wood. So it says in Kabbalah, what wood did he put him on top of? The wood from the tree of knowledge. And the tree of life. After the sin of the tree of knowledge, every human being is jaded in some way by that sin, and there's some kind of selfishness there, some kind of ego there. And so in this action of Avram, he was able to jump to a time and to a space in himself that wasn't affected by the sin of the tree of knowledge. It was totally selfless. But what was so selfless? If what was unique about it was the fact that Hashem imbued this with this imbued Avram with something otherworldly, something godly. So that was also Avram's first test. Avram's first test when he was thrown into the fire. There was also Avram was the first to jump in the fire. And actually, Chassidus says that in that action of jumping in the fire or thrown in the fire, no casting, Avram Avinu opened the channel then. So why does Medrash say that this is the test? This is the number one test. You have to say that yes, Avram opened the channel of sacrifice with his first test, but the last test revealed something that the first test didn't. There's something in the last test that Avram had by offering Yitzchak on the Akedah that revealed what he had accomplished with test number one. So, in other words, Avram Avinu actually channeled God's light of sacrifice of this otherworldly, godly power to go beyond yourself. Avram Avinu brought that to the world with his first test. You only see that godly power in the 10th test. Why? There have been many people in history, not just Jews, also non-Jews, who've given their life for their ideology, for their religion, for their belief. And they wanted to publicize their belief. They wanted to show that how great their ideology is, that they're ready to die for the ideology. But that's not really Mesiras Nefesh. That's not really something otherworldly. That's doing something for the sake of promoting their ideology. In this instance of the Akedah, as you mentioned before, Avram was killing his progeny. It means not only was Avram Avinu not promoting his ideology, he was ruining it. He was ruining what what his whole life was about. Let me unpack this for a second. If I'm giving up my life because of some kind of material gain, some kind of spiritual gain, because I'm going to get Gan Eden, that's obviously not Mesiras Nefesh. I'm doing that because it's logical. I'm doing this because it makes sense. I'm going to get something. That's not Mesiras Nefesh. That's business. If I'm doing it because of promoting my ideology, it's more refined. It's deeper, but it's also limited. It's also logical. In Avraham Avinu offering Yitzchak Akedah, there's no one around. So it wasn't for promoting his ideology. At the most of what it was about was he believed in this very strongly. He believed in this so strongly to the point of sacrifice. He believes in his ideology to the point of sacrifice. But so in other words, it's personal. His dedication to what he believes in. So by other nations, we don't find that kind of thing. In other nations, you find Gandhi or whatever who says, "I'm going to give my life to promote what I believe." This is something holy. In Avraham Avinu saying, Hashem says this, and we'll do what Hashem says no matter what. In that action, there's exhibition of something holy, that it makes sense to Avraham that for the sake of his belief in Hashem, he's going to do all the way for the sake of his belief in Hashem. That's logical. It's not logic of a human being, it's logic of a neshama, but still logic, still limited in being something which could be explained in logic. But because Avraham Avinu was actually ruining his own ideology, he was destroying it. It's identical to Hashem telling a person, take your tzitzis, take your tefillin, and throw them in a fire, burn them. That's what Hashem was telling Avraham Avinu, saying, everything you gave your life for, everything you believe in, you should destroy it. So here, the reason he did this is obvious, that there was no explanation, nothing human, nothing, not just human, nothing even, like last week we were learning about the animal soul, the godly soul. And we learned how Hashem told Avraham Avinu to leave his land and his birthplace and his father's house. And Chassidic explains that your land means your desires. Don't do what you want to do. Go away from what you want to do. Leave your feelings. Leave your thoughts. So the Rebbe said that there's two layers of that. There's our godly soul and our animal soul. Our animal soul has feelings and thoughts and desires. So does our godly soul. And Hashem told Avraham to leave the godly soul too. Do what Hashem wants you to do. And where do you see an expression of that? So that happened so Avraham was there every step of the way. Where do you see an expression that there's nothing within his neshama either, what his neshama wants either? You see it in the Akedah. In the Akedah, you see an expression of it's just the will of Hashem. There's nothing else. And because of the will of Hashem, so he's doing something not that it can't be traced back to himself. It's just because Hashem wants. So it's a great story. It's a great story of heroism. But Hashem tells us to read the story every day. The reason he tells us to read the story every day is just like in the story of the Beis Yosef. Once he brought it to the world, became accessible. So too, the purpose of Avram doing this and us reading the story is that it shouldn't be a story. I don't know if you said Living Torah last night. The Living Torah last night, there was something which was very surprising to me that I never heard before. It was said that people think that divine providence was more revealed in previous times. People could see more divine providence. It says you could see it now more. Now divine providence is more revealed now. So in a similar way, before the coming of Mashiach, it says that Mesiras Nefesh is something which is more, I don't know the word is natural, but it's more prevalent. It's more we have access to it, precisely because we don't have as sophisticated a mind and a heart as previous generations. So it says that the depth of our neshama is more revealed. Like some people, they may not be able to explain to you physics, right? But you see more neshama in them, see more soul in them, right? You know what I'm talking about? Yes. So in a similar way, our generation compared to the previous generations, we don't have, we're missing everything. We don't have any minds, we don't have any hearts. But on the other hand, because of that, we have more Mesiras Nefesh. We're more in touch with the essence of our neshama. And that's why we read the story every day of the Akedah. The purpose of reading the story is to inculcate within us this idea that it's not a story. That we're able every day to do things for the sake of Hashem until coming Mashiach. We make it actually have to tip the scale. We're now empowered, this moment, last moments of Gullus, to do things for the sake of the Eibishter, for the sake of Hashem, without tracing back any signs, any motives.
Rabbi, could you clarify
Yeah.
the wood? Are we talking about the tree of knowledge or the tree of life?
If I remember correctly, both. And I don't know why the tree of life is included. I understand the tree of knowledge, but I don't know why the tree of life is included. It must be the tree of life that was also similar. It maybe has a similarity to the godly soul. It also has a limitation to how holy it is. And that's why it's beyond the tree of life as well. But elsewhere, Chassidus says the tree of life represents the infinite. So I'm not so sure that I said this correctly. And why it would be beyond the tree of life is that the tree of life represents the infinite. As we once learned in the Zohar says that the one who gathered the wood was measuring the tree of life against the tree of knowledge, and he said the tree of life is bigger. The tree of the tree of knowledge is bigger because he once felt that everything has to be limited and explained and measured. But for sure, I have to look it up. But certainly, it was above the tree of knowledge, and if it was above the tree of life, I don't know why it's above the tree of life. The tree of life is the idea of the Akedah, is the idea of being infinite. That's what I wanted to share today. Any questions, comments, criticism? I can always count on you for criticism.
The greatest Kiddush in this shul is with us today.
Avram.
The man.
Evans.
He's the Kiddush of the shul. You know that? The holy man in the shul.
Thank you for joining us, Avram.
Amen.
We're learning all about